2016 Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act provides a powerful tool to impose consequences on those responsible for major human rights abuses. So in December 2017, a little more than a year ago, the White House announced the first set of global sanctions under the Act. Now, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said at the time that, I quote, "The United States is taking a strong stand against human rights abuse and corruption globally by shutting these bad actors out of the U.S. financial system. Treasury is freezing their assets and publicly denouncing the egregious acts they've committed, sending a message that there is a steep price to be paid for their misdeeds." And he continues, "At the direction of President Trump, the Department of the Treasury and our interagency partners will continue to take decisive and impactful actions to hold accountable those who abuse human rights, perpetrate corruption, and undermine American ideals." So on February 5th, our coalition sent a letter to Secretary Mnuchin at the Treasury and Secretary Pompeo at the State Department, urging the use of the Global Magnitsky Act to hold Chinese government officials responsible for the well-documented campaign of oppression targeting Uyghurs and other ethno-religious communities in the Uyghur region. The evidence is uncontestable, despite the great secrecy imposed on the region, limiting the flow of information out. The evidence is found in satellite imagery of greatly expanding camps, prison camps. The testimony of courageous survivors who've come forward despite the fear of what would happen to their relatives when they speak out, and independent media reporting. Most prominently, I want to commend the work of Radio Free Asia's Uyghur service, which is here today, which it is in the hands of Congress to help amplify their work. What it would take to double their funding is an incredibly small amount of money, $1 million, and this is one thing that we should all be in support of the Congress acting immediately. It's within their hands to enable that service to do its work with greater staffing. So the evidence shows that the crimes associated with the Chinese government's campaign in the Uyghur region include unlawful detentions, enforced disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, deaths in custody, extreme forms of religious persecution, forced labor, and sexual assaults. And as our coalition's letter said, this amounts to cultural and religious genocide. So in the persecution of other religious communities, including Falun Gong practitioners, the Church of Almighty God, and Hui Muslims, has also escalated significantly in East Turkestan. Our letter also pointed out that the increasing repression in the Tibet Autonomous Region also requires a vigorous response by the U.S. government. The Chinese government's repressive policies and gross violations of Tibetans' human rights have led to the incredible desperation that has resulted in the immolations, over 150 immolations that you've heard about in recent years. Placing senior Chinese government officials on the list of sanctioned individuals under the Global Magnitsky Act will send an unmistakable message that the United States stands with the people of East Turkestan and Tibet and all persecuted communities, and will meet China's horrifically abusive policies with resolve. So today, we again urge the American government to implement such sanctions with all due haste. Now, for the same reason, the second concrete action is to urge the Congress to act with resolve and dispatch to pass the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that's been mentioned, as well as another act called the Uyghur Intervention and Global Humanitarian Unified Response Act, the Uyghur Act. These are both bipartisan bills with support from key leaders in both the House and the Senate, in both parties, including Speaker Pelosi. They condemn the current ethno-religious repression, amounting, as the Washington Post said, to a campaign of cultural extermination. And they mobilize the resources of the U.S. government to address the crisis. So the Policy Act puts forward 24 findings of gross human rights abuses, urges the president to condemn the repression and impose Magnitsky sanctions, and requires vigorous investigation and reporting on the situation on the part of the agencies of the U.S. government, as well as requiring them to come up with new strategies to use the resources of the government to address the crisis. The other act, the Uyghur Act for short, will prevent advanced technologies, as Congressman Wolf has pointed out is so necessary, from being exported to China to facilitate human rights violations in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. And the act would also ensure that the U.S. government does not procure any goods and services from companies so engaged. It will also create new mechanisms for reporting on the Chinese government's surveillance and harassment of these persecuted groups on U.S. soil. So these bills are endorsed by the Amnesty International and many members of this coalition, International Campaign for Tibet, China Aid, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, the Uyghur American Association, the Uyghur Entrepreneurs Network, 130 American imams and Muslim scholars, a joint statement from 272 American scholars of Central Asia and the Uyghur region have all endorsed this action, as has the Washington Post. So our coalition, which is a powerful form of solidarity amongst all the persecuted groups, will continue to urge the U.S. government to act swiftly and not to delay to end these heinous crimes and to stand strongly with the persecuted groups in their campaign to end this living nightmare. Thank you.